a.m., listening to my daughter's husband drink the coffee I'd made for him, smiling as I counted down to the moment his perfect routine collapsed. My name is Margaret Hale, and I'm 52 years old. I live alone in a beach house in Malibu that I bought after my divorce, not because I wanted to show anyone I'd won, but because I needed a quiet place where the sound of the ocean could drown out the noise of everyone else's opinions. That Tuesday in late August, I was sitting on my back deck in the early sunlight with a warm mug in my hands, watching waves fold themselves into white foam, when a car door slammed hard enough to snap the morning clean in half. I didn't even have time to set my cup down before the front door opened without a knock, and my daughter's voice carried through the house like she still had a bedroom here. "Mom, we're here," she called, as if I'd been expecting her. When I stepped inside, Lena was already hauling suitcases toward the stairs, 3 of them, oversized and expensive-looking. The kind you buy when you expect other people to lift them for you. Behind her came a man I'd never met, well-dressed, carefully groomed, wearing a watch that caught the light like it was trying to announce his value before he opened his mouth. Lena didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission, didn't even slow down long enough to read my face. "Victor," she said brightly, finally turning just enough to present him like a prize. "This is my mother, Mom. This is Victor Cross, my husband." The emphasis on that last word had the sharp edge of defiance, the same edge she'd had at 16 when she announced she was getting her nose pierced, as if the act itself mattered less than proving she didn't need my input. Victor stepped forward with a smile so smooth it could have been practiced in a mirror. "Mrs. Hale, it's wonderful to finally meet you," he said, extending his hand. His voice was warm, confident, a little too eager to please. I shook his hand and felt the pressure of someone who knew exactly how to appear respectful while quietly taking a measurement of my boundaries. "Does she?" I said, letting my tone stay polite while my eyes drifted to the luggage. "And what brings you both here?" Unannounced, Lena breezed past the question as if it were a formality. "We're on our honeymoon," she announced, and the way she said it made it sound like a natural right. "We wanted somewhere peaceful and private. Hotels are so impersonal, don't you think?" She glanced around my living room like she was scanning for flaws, like my yoga mat and paintbrushes were evidence of a life she found inconvenient. I looked at Victor, expecting him to offer something that resembled courtesy. But he just watched me with an appreciative calm. The way people look at oceanfront property when they're calculating resale value. When I asked how long they planned to stay, he answered quickly, "Just a few days." But Lena corrected him without looking up from her phone. "A week, maybe. We'll see." Spontaneous. Right. She grinned like she'd just said something charming, and I felt an old pressure in my chest, the familiar sensation of being pushed into accommodating her, because pushing back always came with consequences. I told myself to breathe, to be gracious, because the man beside her was new, and I didn't want my first impression to be a fight. I showed them the guest room, apologizing that the bed wasn't made, and there were storage boxes tucked neatly against the wall. Lena bounced on the mattress like she owned it. Victor ran his fingers along the window frame, looking out at the stretch of ocean as if it belonged to him in some future version of the world. "This is beautiful," he said softly, and I couldn't tell whether it was admiration or appetite. While they walked down to the beach that afternoon, I changed the sheets, moved the boxes, fluffed pillows, and tried to understand what was tugging at my instincts. Lena had shown up in my life uninvited plenty of times, usually when she needed something: money, reassurance, shelter from a mess she created. But this felt different. This felt planned. By dinner, I knew why. Victor stepped outside to take a phone call, and Lena poured herself a glass of my good wine without asking, settling into my couch with the ease of someone who assumed the world would rearrange itself for her comfort. "Mom, we need to talk about something," she said, swirling the wine like she was buying time to make it sound reasonable. "I'm listening," I replied, already feeling the cold spread under my ribs. Lena leaned forward, eyes bright with manufactured concern. "Victor and we're not just here for a romantic getaway. We think it might be time for you to consider your living situation." The words hit like a slap disguised as a hug. "My living situation," I repeated, keeping my voice steady. "You're all alone out here," she said, lowering her tone as if she were doing me a favor. What if you fall? What if something happens and no one knows? Victor thinks and I agree that maybe you should move into something more manageable. A condo, closer to town, safer. At the confident way she sat in my home, and spoke about uprooting my life like she was rearranging furniture, and I felt something sharp settle into place. This wasn't concern. It was strategy. When Victor returned, his smile slid back onto his face like a mask he'd learned to wear in rooms where people signed papers. He sat with us and spoke with that smooth sincerity again, calling Lena's idea practical, describing my home as a lot of house for one person, and using words like maximize and potential, the way some men use pet names, soft, convincing, meant to disarm. I listened, nodding in the right places, but inside I was watching his eyes, the way they moved around the room like he was mentally removing walls. Replacing my life with his plan, Lena thought she'd brought home a husband. What she'd actually brought home, I realized, was someone who looked at my beach house the way predators look at open doors. And that night, as I stood at the sink washing my own dishes while my daughter and her new husband went upstairs like guests checking into a resort, I made myself a quiet promise. I didn't say out loud, if they came here to take my home, they were about to learn the difference between a woman who lives alone and a woman who is unprotected. By the next morning, Lena had decided my kitchen was now an extension of her marriage. I was standing at the stove just after 6 a.m., scrambling eggs out of habit rather than obligation, when she walked in, scrolling on her phone, and announced, without looking up, that we needed to set expectations while they were staying here. Victor sat at the counter reading financial headlines on his tablet, humming softly like a man already settled into a routine he hadn't earned. When I asked what expectations she meant, Lena finally lifted her eyes and explained that Victor was an early riser, that he needed quiet mornings, strong coffee, and a proper breakfast before his calls with the East Coast. She said it casually, as if she were discussing weather, then added that since I was always up early and loved cooking, it would be helpful if breakfast was ready by 5 a.m. tomorrow. 5 a.m. The words hung between us, while I flipped the eggs and felt something inside me go very still. Victor smiled in a way that suggested gratitude while confirming entitlement, telling me they'd be incredibly appreciative of any assistance I could provide as the host, not mother, not homeowner, host. Like I was running a bed and breakfast he hadn't booked. I said nothing in that moment, served breakfast, and watched Victor eat with the careful satisfaction of a man accustomed to being catered to. He complimented the food, told me I had a gift for domestic things. And Lena chimed in that it was good practice for when I moved somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. When they left for town later that morning, announcing they'd be back for dinner as if it were an order, I stood in the driveway watching their rental car disappear and felt the last of my patience dissolve into clarity. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and began researching Victor Cross, not with suspicion, but with purpose. It didn't take long. His investment company had a polished website and very little substance, a handful of dissolved entities, and one ongoing property project tangled in foreclosure proceedings. His name appeared in connection with a lawsuit filed by elderly homeowners who claimed they'd been pressured into selling below market value, promised monthly income that never arrived. I found his ex-wife, Jenna Walsh, a woman whose catering business had vanished around the same time their marriage ended. And finally, I found Eleanor Briggs, an elderly woman in Riverside whose name appeared in a small local article about financial disputes involving Victor's company. By the time Lena and Victor returned that evening with shopping bags and glowing stories about local real estate agents who said houses like mine were highly desirable, I understood exactly why they were here. I played my part carefully. I nodded, smiled, and told them I'd been thinking about everything they said. Victor's eyes lit up when I mentioned his breakfast routine again, and I assured him I'd have something special ready at 5 a.m. He kissed Lena's cheek like a man who believed he'd already won, and that night I served dinner on my best plates while they talked about renovations and rental income as if my house were already theirs. When they finally went upstairs, I poured myself a glass of wine, stood on the deck listening to the ocean, and planned my response not with anger, but with precision. At 4 a.m., my alarm went off. I moved quietly through the kitchen, grinding coffee beans the way Victor liked, preparing eggs Benedict with the practiced ease of someone who'd been cooking her entire adult life. I crushed natural laxative tablets into fine powder and mixed them carefully into the coffee grounds and hollandaise sauce. Not enough to cause harm, just enough to turn his perfectly controlled morning into chaos. When Victor appeared at 4:47 a.m., in a silk robe, surprised and impressed that everything was ready early, I poured his coffee into my finest cup and watched him drink it with satisfaction. He praised the food, the coffee, my attentiveness, and told me Lena was right about my talents. I smiled and told him I believed in giving people exactly what they ask for. Less than an hour later, I heard his footsteps rushing upstairs, his voice tight as he asked Lena where the bathroom was, then asked if there was another one. By the third trip, he was pale and sweating. By the fifth, he was panicked. Lena paced the kitchen asking if we had stomach medicine, and I handed over antacids that would do nothing, offering sympathy and suggesting it might be food poisoning from yesterday. Victor insisted it couldn't be breakfast, the timing didn't match. And I agreed with a calm that felt almost merciful. When they finally left for urgent care, Victor hunched over in the passenger seat. I cleaned my kitchen and disposed of what was left of the tablets, knowing this was only the beginning. That afternoon, while Victor rested upstairs and Lena hovered anxiously, I called Eleanor Briggs and listened to her frightened confusion about missed payments and looming foreclosure. I called Jenna Walsh and heard the quiet strength in her voice as she described how Victor had dismantled her life piece by piece. By the time Victor emerged the next morning, weaker but eager to resume the conversation about my future, I was ready. When he began explaining how he specialized in helping seniors transition out of properties they could no longer manage, I smiled, asked thoughtful questions, and told him I wanted to move forward on one condition. I wanted my attorney and financial advisor involved, and I wanted Jenna Walsh present. The color drained from Victor's face so fast it was almost startling, and in that moment, I knew the trap was set. Victor tried to recover quickly, but there was a tremor beneath his confidence once I mentioned Jenna Walsh by name. Lena looked between us, confused, her earlier certainty cracking as she asked why her husband's ex-wife would be involved in my financial decisions. I answered calmly, explaining that when someone proposes to manage my entire future, I like to understand their past, and Jenna had been remarkably forthcoming about the way Victor convinced her to leverage her business for investments that only benefited him. Victor interrupted with practiced irritation, dismissing her as bitter, claiming misunderstandings. But when I mentioned Eleanor Briggs and the foreclosure proceedings tied to his company, he went silent. The room felt smaller, the ocean suddenly too loud through the windows, and Lena's face drained of color as realization began to set in. She asked Victor directly what I was talking about, and he reached for her hand, telling her it was complicated, that markets fail, that people misremember details. I didn't raise my voice when I told her that the state of California had a very clear memory, especially when formal complaints were filed, and that I'd submitted mine the day before with documentation from multiple victims. The shift was immediate. Victor stood so abruptly, his chair scraped the floor, his charm gone, replaced by something cold and calculating as he accused me of paranoia and threatened legal action. I opened the manila folder on the counter and spread the contents out slowly, letting the weight of paper speak for itself. I explained that my financial advisor, Harold Bennett, was a forensic accountant who'd already flagged irregularities across Victor's dissolved entities, and that Detective Sarah Lynn from Financial Crimes had been very interested in the pattern emerging from his work. Lena sank into her chair as Victor backed toward the door, insisting I had no proof, until I mentioned Eleanor by name again and said she'd been hoping to speak with him about the payments that never arrived. That was when he ran. Abandoning his phone on the counter, fleeing up the stairs to pack while Lena sat frozen, whispering that she'd married a criminal. After Victor sped away in their rental car, leaving silence in his wake, Lena stayed at my kitchen table staring at the evidence like it might rearrange itself into a different truth. When Eleanor Briggs called the abandoned phone moments later, her trembling voice asking why the bank was threatening her home, I answered and gave her numbers for legal aid in the Attorney General's office, my hands steady while my chest burned. When I hung up, Lena asked what she was supposed to do now, and I told her she had a choice: protect a man who had used her, or cooperate and protect herself. By that afternoon, Detective Lynn arrived, followed soon after by federal agents once the scope of Victor's network became clear. For hours, Lena and I answered questions, timelines, patterns, names, and by the time they left, Victor was no longer just a runaway husband, he was a fugitive tied to a multi-state fraud operation. That night, Lena received a call from him while we sat together on the deck. He begged, accused me of lies, promised love, but when Lena confronted him with Eleanor's story and my cooperation with investigators, his voice shifted from pleading to angry to empty. She told him she was filing for divorce and ended the call with a finality that surprised even her. I thought that would be the end, but 3 days later, Agent Daniel Morales from the FBI stood in my living room holding a photo of my guest bedroom, pointing out a small metallic object hidden behind a plant. He explained they believed Victor had hidden a portable hard drive there, containing records of his entire operation, and that if they simply seized it, Victor would disappear for good. Their plan was simple and terrifying. Let him come back for it. I would call him, tell him I was scared and alone, and wear a wire while he incriminated himself trying to retrieve what he'd left behind. I agreed, not because I was fearless, but because I was done being underestimated. That evening, with agents hidden around my property, I called Victor and told him Lena had left, that I was overwhelmed, that I wanted peace. He took the bait, saying he needed to return late that night to collect personal items, asking me to unlock the doors. When I hung up, Agent Morales nodded, telling me he'd be here within hours. As midnight passed and the house settled into darkness, I stood at my upstairs window watching the driveway, knowing Victor Cross believed he was walking back into control. What he didn't know was that this house, the one he'd tried to steal, was about to become the place where everything finally collapsed. Victor returned at 2:47 a.m., moving through my garden with the quiet confidence of someone who believed fear belonged to other people. From the top of the stairs, with Agent Rachel Kim positioned just behind me, I watched him let himself in using the spare key Lena had given him on their first day, a small detail that told me he had always planned to come back. He called my name softly from the kitchen, his voice controlled, almost tender, and when I stepped into the light wearing my robe, he smiled as if this were a reconciliation instead of a crime scene. He said he was glad I'd come to my senses, that everything could still be handled quietly, but when he stepped closer, I saw the outline of a gun tucked into his waistband, and the air in the room changed instantly. He told me I was the real problem now, the witness whose cooperation had turned his life upside down, and that if something unfortunate happened to me, the entire case would collapse. He spoke about it the way businessmen talk about losses, detached and efficient, and in that moment I understood he hadn't come for evidence or clothes. He had come for me. Before he could take another step, Agent Daniel Morales announced himself from the kitchen doorway, ordering Victor to drop the weapon, and Agent Kim appeared behind me with her gun drawn. Victor spun, weapon raised, shouting that no one move, that he would take me with him if he had to, and for a heartbeat the house felt frozen between violence and resolve. I didn't scream or run. I stepped slightly forward and told him calmly that he was forgetting something important, that he wasn't the only one who planned ahead. When I pressed the panic device Agent Kim had given me, every light in the house went out at once, plunging us into darkness. And the electromagnetic pulse system Harold Bennett had quietly installed in my basement activated, disabling every electronic device within range. Victor pulled the trigger twice in blind panic, but the gun's electronic safety failed, and in the confusion agents rushed him, forcing him to the floor as the lights came back on. He was handcuffed and shaking, his confidence finally stripped away, and as they led him out, he turned back to me with hatred in his eyes and said it wasn't over. I told him quietly that it was. 3 days later, the FBI confirmed Victor was cooperating, his network far larger than any of us initially imagined, with dozens of active targets across multiple states. Files recovered from his devices, detailed psychological profiles, financial assets, and contingency plans for women like me. and the word termination sat coldly in one of those documents, a reminder of how close I'd come to becoming a statistic. Eleanor Briggs' home was saved through recovered funds, Jenna Walsh testified publicly, and Lena spent weeks untangling herself from a marriage that had been designed from the start to use her. When Agent Kim returned with a proposal asking me to consult on a new task force focused on romance and family-based fraud, I didn't answer immediately. I sat with the weight of it, the risk, the responsibility, and then I thought about the women who would never see it coming if no one warned them. 6 months later, I was sitting in a cafe in Portland, pretending to read while watching a widow named Carol Peterson listen to a man who sounded exactly like Victor once had. When I interrupted their meeting and mentioned Victor's name, the man's composure cracked, and moments later FBI agents stepped in and arrested Marcus Webb, one of the network's leaders. Carol cried when she realized how close she'd come to losing everything, and I held her hand and told her she wasn't foolish, she was targeted. Since then, more arrests followed, assets were returned, and the network began to unravel, not because criminals suddenly grew kinder, but because women started trusting their instincts and asking better questions. Now, I'm back on my deck in Malibu, the ocean just as steady as it's always been, my house still mine. Lena visits often, quieter now, more grounded, learning what it means to build a life without borrowing someone else's confidence. I didn't set out to become a consultant or a witness or a warning. I just refused to be erased from my own story. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Independence makes some people uncomfortable, especially those who profit from taking it away. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told you needed help when what someone really wanted was control, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what this made you feel.